Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs War Room Update. We are on day number 257 of the war with the Gaza Strip, with the terrorists who have been holding Israeli hostages, now 120 in number, for 257 days in captivity. Men, women, children, elderly, sick, infirm, all being held by the genocidal terrorists. They've been there now for almost 9 months, and it's carrying on. The fighting on the ground to bring about the release of those hostages and to destroy that genocidal terrorist organization is continuing on. IDF forces operating in the north of the Gaza Strip and also, but most importantly, in the southern Gaza Strip, clearing almost the entire passage along that southern border with Egypt. It's called the Philadelphia Corridor. We've spoken about it a lot on the War Room updates. And now we are seeing the IDF forces really taking control not only of the Rafah crossing itself, but also of that entire area adjacent to Egypt, where we saw a constant flow of oxygen into the terrorist organization, not oxygen as in the air that we breathe, but rather oxygen in the form of munitions, weapons, RPGs, things that we've seen being fired at Israel all the way through the conflict. And if you were wondering how has this terrorist organization managed to survive for 9 months against the Israeli war machine? Well, there's your answer. It's been coming in from Egypt through dozens, if not hundreds of tunnels that passed under the Philadelphia Corridor, under that border, going into the Gaza Strip. It could have been food going into the Gaza Strip. It could have been Gazans leaving the Gaza Strip to seek refuge in other countries, different countries, Western countries maybe. But there was nothing like that. It's been one-way traffic from Egypt, weapons to the genocidal terrorists, and that's how they've continued on fighting. In the north, we've continued on with that war of attrition with another one of the Iranian proxies, with Hezbollah. There it's day number 256. They started their war the day after the October 7 massacre, and their activities have just been escalating time after time after time as days go on, as months goes on, and they see that Israel's response is limited to their aggression, to their attacks on Israel. They understand that they can continue on pushing Israel to its limit, almost with no repercussions. Israel is, of course, responding, but there isn't an entire war going on in Lebanon. Israel's responses are limited mostly to the southern parts of Lebanon, and where necessary, going further north, but not on a great scale. We're not at war just with Hezbollah. Israel is at war with Lebanon. Lebanon is a sovereign country, and Lebanon should be really required to rein in the terrorists that operate freely within its territory or face the consequences. And that is something which Lebanon is going to soon have to do when Israel can no longer tolerate what's going on in our north. We still have some 70 to 80,000 Israeli citizens who have been forced out of their homes, evacuated because they can't live in those houses. Excuse me. They can no longer live there. They've been forced to wander around Israel, going home sporadically for the last 9 months. It's an unbelievable situation. In Judea and Samaria, the terrorists are carrying on. Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, both of them operating as Iranian proxies, are continue on with their aggression as well, continue on trying to carry out terrorist attacks, as many as they can, as often as they can, to kill Jews. That's the goal. Let's just remember that. That's their goal, to eradicate Israel. Hamas's charter clearly says it. The goal is to eradicate Israel. They're supported with political and financial support by the so-called moderate Palestinian Authority run by Mahmoud Abbas. But it's one common goal driving these people all forward. In the south, we have the Houthis are still operating from Lebanon, still interrupting the freedom of navigation, still firing cruise missiles at innocent ships trying to pass through, coming up through the Straits of Tiran and going up through to the Suez Canal. They're interrupting all of international trade only as a part of the Iranian war on Israel. Iran's in every single corner of this battle. It's in Syria with the Iranian militias. It's in Lebanon with Hezbollah. It's in Judea and Samaria with Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas, and sending massive arms caches, as we saw just in March, to the Palestinian Authority. It's in Gaza. It's operating everywhere. So what you really have is this octopus that's spreading its tentacles all over the region, and not only in the Middle East. It goes much further. It goes into South America. It goes into Africa. That really destruction that the Iranian regime is creating. But if you follow all of the responses of the different countries, everyone who's being affected, the Europeans who are being affected, the US who have been affected, and Israel who's been affected, the response has generally been to the proxies. Look at where the proxies are operating. We're going to respond to Hamas. We're going to respond to Palestinian Islamic Jihad. We're going to respond to the Houthis. We're going to respond to Hezbollah. The response against Iran has been very limited. And so today I'm joined by our special guest, Barak Seener. Barak is a senior fellow at the Henry Jackson Society and a founder of Strategic Intelligentsia, a political risk organization. Barak is also the co-host of the Geo Godfather Wars podcast. He's an author of a number of different reports, which all really play into this wider understanding of what's going on in our region. How can we restore the deterrence against Iran? A report written by Barak. How do we see Qatar's influence on this whole area? How does Qatar fit into this whole picture and really this whole equation? Are they a stabilizing force or a destabilizing force? How do the Abraham Accords play into this? Is this something which should be really bolstered, extended, widened? Or is it something which is inconvenient for the Iranians? And therefore, that's what they're trying to do, to really undermine the basis of those agreements. So, Barak, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So really the question is, let's start with Iran as that destabilizing force. I saw a recent podcast that you ran, and I think it's right to say, correct me if I'm wrong, that you believe that the response of both the US administration, the European Union, and Israel to all of these different threats is just not on the right mark. It should be focusing more on Iran and less directly on the proxies. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yes, and I think it's important to go into the reasons for this. Historically, America has traditionally had limited responses against Iranian aggression, and this has gone over the course of successive administrations, even starting from the Reagan administration, when US servicemen were attacked in Beirut. There was a very limited response, if at all, and there have been hundreds and hundreds of attacks on US assets across the region, and the US's response has been limited. Now, one of the reasons today, while it's limited, is America seeks to, in a sense, Vietnamize its foreign policy, anchoring its strategic interests in the region via a security architecture molded by the Abraham Accords, underpinned in a sense by Israel's military growth and enabling America to pivot towards the Asia Pacific. So America is demonstrating to its strategic partners across the region that it is, in a sense, non-committal. Fine, on one hand, operationally, you have CENTCOM, which plays a very formidable presence in the region, but at a strategic, but that's at an operational level. At a strategic level, America keeps giving its allies mixed signals, and this prompts its allies to hedge. So a country like Saudi Arabia will, on one hand, seek security guarantees and enhance security ties with the West, with the US, so via the Abraham Accords, while at the same time be courted by China, join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and be courted by the BRICS as well. So by being non-committal, it's actually emboldened Iran. Every time the Biden administration stresses its strategic priorities to de-escalate, in Iran's ears, that's highly provocative. This enables Iran to sense that it will have no sense of accountability for any of its malign activities. Now, Iran is inching towards the nuclear status. Could you imagine October the 7th happening with Hamas enjoying Iran's nuclear umbrella? It would be a catastrophe. Could you imagine if today Hezbollah had Iran's nuclear umbrella? It would be a disaster. So what happened is America very much wants to localize, de-escalate tensions in the region in order that it can focus on great power competition with China. But even more broadly than that, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, Western governments merely followed the trend and respected the trend. And even though the Muslim Brotherhood cleaned up in Egypt and Tunisia and other places, rather than attempting to foster a secular, liberal, pro-Western alternative, they just basically set a precedent to local populations that the Muslim Brotherhood is a legitimate alternative for them. So what happened during that time period and from then onwards was that Iran, it exploited the schisms that were taking place across Middle East societies and was extending its sphere of influence, its famous Shia arc, through the region. And it has now sought to not only extend the Shia arc, but encircle Israel through a ring of fire, with Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, and also Hamas's involvement in the West Bank. So while America's been focused on de-escalation or not taking the bait from Iran, Iran has successfully molded the region in its image, despite the Shia being a majority in the region. And now that's quite a huge strategic accomplishment.
Minority.
And what Israel does is its response tends to be quite limited, which is to strike at Iran's surrogates, such as Hamas and Hezbollah, prevent Hezbollah from entrenching a military foothold in its border with Lebanon or Syria. But what Israel doesn't do is expand its power projection to hold Iran accountable for the action of its proxies and to actually say, we don't make any distinction between sub-state actors that are proxies of the source that sponsors them, which is the Iranian regime. So all this is indicating to Iran that they will never be held accountable and they continue to flex.
What you seem to be describing, Barak, is a situation where the Western countries, on the one hand, are trying to de-escalate the situation locally, to only look at the local manifestations of the violence, of the terrorism, whereas Iran is really trying to do the exact opposite, to increase and expand its influence through these proxies, every time adding on another front and another organization. It would seem that really it seems like America's talking English and the Iranians are talking Parsi, and there's no translation in between. There's two different ideologies.
I think you've touched on something quite profound, which is the fact that Western nations are not focusing on expansiveness. In the 21st century, our notion of expansiveness is only in terms of economic growth of GDP, right? If you look at authoritarian states, they have a very 19th century conception of power, which is expansiveness in terms of territory and conquest. So if you look what Russia has done in Ukraine, violating the sovereignty of another nation's borders, which is unheard of in the West in the 21st century, it's a 19th century move. They don't care the fact that as a result of that, they're going to have a siege economy. Their priority is dignity and territorial conquest, not economic growth. If you see, for example, China, its economy has now floundered. They initially made no distinction between economic growth and territorial expansion. And their territorial expansion was not simply in the South China Seas, but through its Belt Road Initiative that would not only cause them to dominate other economies, but give them access to global markets, Africa, South America, Middle East, Europe. So China's been incredibly expansive. Iran has also been incredibly expansive through its Shia arcs, encircling Israel, molding the entire regime in its image. And the West does not see, Western democratic nations do not have long-term strategic vision simply because their governments don't stay in office for that long. But we tend to be back-footed, very, very reactive, and not being able to mold in our image. We do not have anything of the equivalent of the Marshall Plan post-World War II, where America successfully molded Europe in its image.
It would seem like on that front, part of what I at least understand to be the US approach here is that the US marched into Iraq, they marched into Afghanistan, and 20 years later they seem to have left almost with their tails between their legs, never having actually managed to implement any major change. And because it seems again that they're not able to adapt to the thinking of the local mindset. Rather, they're trying to bring in a Western ideology into an area which really isn't looking for that type of an influence, and really is looking and pushing for something else. And then they don't understand why they've been unsuccessful without ever acknowledging the fact that, well, maybe it's not just different languages. It's not only metaphoric. It's metaphoric as well as being literal. That they just don't understand the mindset, and because it's so foreign to them.
Look, I would say that Bin Laden picked up on this when he saw, he explicitly referred to America as a paper tiger. He legitimized the 9/11 attacks by saying that America simply had no staying power. Now, he had multiple historical precedents in order to draw this conclusion from it. You see already at the end of the Cold War, when, the West successfully caused the complete dismantling of the Soviet Union. But when you had the Nunn-Lugar Cooperation Threat Reduction, which was geared towards stabilizing uranium in the region, to prevent a proliferation of nuclear, chemical weapons, or just simply fissile materials. what was not achieved was stabilizing these regions, creating governance, really good governance. We just simply thought, right, look, let's stabilize it, that there won't be a proliferation of unconventional materials, but we won't do the secondary act of stabilizing it. And I mean, even prior to that, bin Laden refers to America's exit from Vietnam and the humiliation that ensued. He would be crowing if he saw the Biden administration's just undignified exit, rapid exit from Afghanistan. So we don't seem to, in an age of financial austerity, inflation, and progressive politics where we don't have coherent identities, we're not able to even, if we don't have a coherent identity and everything is relativistic, then you're not going to be able to have a robust national security strategy that will project your ethos abroad and export your value system abroad, because on the contrary, exporting anything is considered politically incorrect. And our value systems are evolving so rapidly that we are losing legitimacy. I mean, 2 decades ago, when one spoke about exporting democracy, it was about transparent and accountable governance structures that would promote human rights. Today, it is about exporting diversity. Democracy has been redefined from human rights accountability to diversity. So good luck promoting LGBTQ values in Saudi Arabia or African states which have traditional values. So the modern conception of democracy is actually creating a clash of civilizations. It's really widening the fault lines between civilizations, and all these authoritarian regimes such as Russia or China, they're able to claim the mantle of conservative, patriarchal, traditional conservative values. They'll be saying, look, you want democracy. Look what they're doing with their democracy. They're questioning their gender, or they're having fights with pronouns, while we are offering you glories of empire. We are offering you Mother Russia or the Middle Empire, which is China. And they're making a compelling case to their own civilians. And we don't have a counter narrative. So in an age of disinformation, we always bemoan disinformation. We don't even have a prism to internalize news, and we open ourselves up to foreign actors fostering schisms within our societies via disinformation, because we're doing it to ourselves.
What seems to be amazing, Barak, is that not only are these regimes managing to internally influence the discussion that's being carried on, and really gaining the support of the populations for their actions, but they're also managing to really take over the discourse, even in Western countries. We've seen it on the campuses in the US, in England, in Europe, where now they're taking that same really anti-liberal, all Western values, and coming to the hometowns and bringing in their own separate values and contradictory values. And so they're not only winning at home, so it would appear, but they're also managing to take that and make it into an international discussion. How are we not managing to even identify in our home grounds that this is a destructive force which has grown in their own countries and is now coming to our own backyards?
it's going back to what I said previously. It's about having a rational, coherent national identity, and identifying essential values in that. The easiest place to achieve that you would have thought is America, in that it means something to be American. It means a form of institutional nationalism that will successfully integrate people from all backgrounds into an institutional democracy where you have separation of powers and a codified constitution and a Bill of Rights. It means something to be American, and the days you saw the erosion of that from, once upon a time you had a President Reagan that referred to America as a shining city on a hill, and then you had subsequently President Obama that spoke about celebrating American exceptionalism in the same way that Greeks would celebrate Greek exceptionalism. There was no absolutism anymore. It opened itself up to relativism. And then I remember President Obama, carrying Fareed Zakaria's book, The Post-American Century, which for President Obama was an ideal. As soon as you become a relativist, then you have no absolute value system and your legitimacy rapidly crumbles. Now, the social Marxists that took over American campuses, they lost on the economic front, but they won on the cultural front. Well, this relativistic approach really gave them a lot of fodder to play with. It's unfashionable today to speak about an objective, absolute ethos. You don't hear that in the secular world. You will hear that in the religious world, but you won't hear that in the secular world. And that's why in game theory, autocrats win or radicals win, and the relativists lose.
It's amazing when you then combine into this whole discussion really tremendous economic strength. When you look at places like Qatar, Qatar spent many years quietly under the radar developing its liquefied natural gas industry, really becoming a world force, if not the world leader, and now using a gas field which is, to the best of my understanding, a fifth of all of the gas in the world that Qatar shares with Iran, is now really dominating that whole really international scene of gas and gas production and gas exports, really Qatar being probably one of the biggest winners out of the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Even countries like Holland, where it would seem to be that they're not really trying to get away from that fundamentalist approach of Islam, they are simultaneously now dependent on Qatar for their provision of gas. And so you have this Muslim Brotherhood country that runs the biggest propaganda system that the world has ever seen, really, Al Jazeera, giving out that same messaging, really in bed together with Iran, now trying to dominate that entire, not only the ideological scene, the ideological discussion, the undermining of European values, but also trying to dominate really world economies via, again, seeing what we saw in the mid-70s with the Arab oil boycott. Now we're seeing that same stranglehold of the Muslim Brotherhood countries, Iran, Qatar, and really gripping the world.
I would say
to
this.
influence their ideologies.
I would say this in contrast to the relativism that creates a very grey identity in the West. You have autocrats doing exactly the same thing, but in a very managed way towards a certain goal, which is self-survival. And so the West genuinely subscribes to relativism, but it's unmanaged. Autocrats subscribe to it, but in a very managed manner towards strategic goals. Before I get to Qatar, I'll just say, if you look at China, right, their entire approach has been initially transactional, upon which they build diplomatic ties, upon which they build security ties. But it begins with a very neutral transactional approach of just seeking opportunities and capitalizing on them. If you look at, and it's about, their objectives have been that their strategic goals would be aligned with their economic interests, and that there was no dissonance between the two. If you look at Qatar, Qatar has also managed this kind of relativism for the sake of regime survival. So, Qatar is a grey state. It is completely ambiguous. But I would say that their primary objective is to survive in a volatile region, even if it entails them doing cynical moves to do so. So you mentioned Qatar's gas fields. So its offshore North fields is contiguous with Iran's South Pars field. They share the same gas fields. At the same time, Qatar is hosting the Uludaid base in Qatar, which controls all the air activities of US and allied forces over a huge expanse of the Middle East. It's really a critical facility. So what you see Qatar doing is positioning itself between, on one hand, aligning itself with Iran economically or with natural resources, and security-wise in a pro-Western manner. And at the same time, it will cultivate the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islamism across the region. And so therefore, it ticks every box that will ensure its survival. So when you look at Qatar's sovereign wealth fund that is purchasing huge properties across the West, the City of London is owned by Qatar. It's like a state within a state, because you've got its military establishment functioning one way, you've got its economic establishment functioning another way, and it means that you have a state that is not cogent, that does not, but it's only cogent to a specific goal, which is its own survival. And it's not the only state to do that. Look, Saudi Arabia being courted by the BRICS and taking a position in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization while wanting a NATO-styled security alliance with the US, right? You have India that's been a non-aligned state, where on one hand, it wants economic ties with China, too big to ignore, but on the other hand, wants security ties with the West. You had Turkey that did the same thing. It had a zero problems foreign policy, where it aligned itself with Arab states and even Iran, and then it emerged by having no friends. And I would say that Israel has done exactly the same thing, in playing this type of ambiguity, because on one hand, it bemoans the radicalism fostered by the Palestinian Authority, right, with their pay-for-slay scheme. And then at the end of the day, they will undermine the execution of the Taylor Force Act by saying, oh my gosh, we need funds to go to the Palestinian Authority because we need to prop it up. Otherwise, there'll be a vacuum of governance that we can't contend with. So Israel's been very, very incoherent. So don't underestimate the degree of the influence that incoherence has towards statecraft. We think that statecraft is a rational calculus. that rationality may also be informed by incoherence. Now, Qatar's done it, Turkey's done it, um, Saudi Arabia's done it, Israel does it. Um, yeah.
Yeah, without question. I think when Israel plays into that narrative of when we're discussing what is erroneously called maybe the day after in Gaza, really it's the decade after in Gaza. It requires that first step of destroying Hamas, and then you have this discussion of, well, who will come in their place. So I can almost hear the discussion in closed rooms where the US says, well, we want the Palestinian Authority, and Israel says, well, absolutely not. The Palestinian Authority is a destabilizing function. It promotes anti-Semitism. It promotes incitement. It has the pay-for-slay terror war program, and therefore we can never allow them to come back in. But then the US responds by saying, well, in Judea and Samaria, you're happy to allow them to continue functioning. Not only that, you say that they are almost a positive influence, and therefore this contradiction cannot really be carried on. And so yeah, Israel really does have to decide, are you in favor of the Palestinian Authority, in which case it should be in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip potentially, or is it something which is destructive? Now, I would suggest that the approach be to adopt the second option, to recognize the fact that the Palestinian Authority is a very, very destructive element. It brought in this idea of undermining, delegitimizing, and bringing about the destruction of Israel. And really, they were the source for the Hamas operations. They were the ones who included Hamas in the elections. And so they really are a very evil force. And yet we seem to be still playing that tango with them, trying to enjoy almost, as it were, all of the best worlds, which is really the same as what we're doing with Iran and with on the other hand, also Qatar, recognizing that Qatar is Muslim Brotherhood, is funding Hamas, but on the other hand, courting Qatar to be involved in the discussions and the negotiations to bring about the freeing of the hostages. So really that incoherence in policy isn't really only the part of the US, the EU, the Brits, but really very much led also by Israel.
Look, I agree, but I think that we have to bear something in mind. If you're going to be coherent, there are implications of being coherent. Being coherent entails that you adopt a very singular approach, and that you're going to dedicate yourself to contending with the fallout of that. There are huge implications of it. So, for example, if, let's say, Israel was like, look, the Palestinian Authority is not a partner for peace. It is also a sponsor of radicalism, and it's fostered much of the culture in which the October the 7th attacks took place within, right? Yeah. Now, if Israel adopts that approach, then it has to think, what are the implications? Fine. So then Israel doesn't fund, and if Israel's going to be coherent about it, that would entail then Israel doesn't it doesn't fund the Palestinian Authority, which means then that there is no functioning governance body for the Palestinians. And as Colin Powell said vis-a-vis Iraq, if you break it, you own it. So then if Israel owns it, then Israel needs to, I'm not being political here, but it would have to kind of colonize areas that it doesn't want to be in. It has to own it. And then the implications of that is it has to consider, right, is there an alternative? Is there a genuinely moderate alternative for us to cultivate? Now, the Khalil Shikaki polls say that there aren't really. And if there aren't really, being a strategist, one has to adopt a worst case scenario first and be pleasantly surprised if that's not the case. And if that's not, so then if there is no alternative, remember Salam Fayyad, that offered genuine prospects. He was the darling of the West, World Bank technocrat. He only got like 2 or 3% support.
Yeah.
So then you have to then consider, okay, if you own it, is there a day after? Maybe there is no day after. Maybe conflict is going to be a perpetual reality. And then that entails you sinking a huge amount of financial resources to develop infrastructure on your terms, um, and creating governance and creating strategic comms programs which fosters an alternative ethos. Now, from what I observe of Israel is it lacks that capability, it lacks that sophistication, right? And it lacks those resources and it lacks that willpower. So it doesn't want to own, it doesn't want to break something because it doesn't want to own it. But and then instead they will keep something that is inherently anti-Semitic and radical in place. Just bear in mind that if you're going to break something, you need to commit an enormous amount of resources to build it according to your will. And policy is incoherent because nobody wants to go to the nth degree.
So maybe we should question Colin Powell's idea of if you break it, then you own it. I think it's possible to a great extent to go to war with a clear genocidal enemy and not be then responsible for their rehabilitation. If Israel were to focus today on neutralizing the source of much of the anti-Israel activity, taking this war to Iran, to Tehran, I don't think you could raise the argument that, well, if Israel destroys the Mullah regime, we would then have to take some type of responsibility for rehabilitating Iran.
I agree with you.
So the question is, how close do you take it? How far do you take it? Colin Powell said, if you own it, if you break it, you own it, and that's failed entirely.
Well, I would agree with you only 50%, in that you cannot go to war with Hamas and dismantle it, anticipate a better alternative with the regime in Tehran still in place. And I think that if you go to war with a proxy, then you ought to be destabilizing the regime at the same time. The source of the problem. If somebody has an illness, you don't just simply, you don't simply address the symptoms, you address the cause itself. But in terms of Hamas, to a great degree, what you're saying is ahistorical, because if you look at what Western powers have done in the past, it's been a three-pronged equation. After World War II, or rather during World War II, what it did was, in order to transform a culture successfully, it did three things in a certain sequence. Number one, it coerced the environment. Number two, it created infrastructure. And number three, it re-educated that population. So whether you're talking about Germany, West Germany post-World War II, that became a success story, or whether you refer to Japan after World War II, you're talking about mass coercion, mass devastation, upon which you develop infrastructure and re-educate the population. But today's statecraft doesn't allow for that scale of activity, which means that your policy toolkit is very, very limited. But the dynamics, it's not Colin Powell's policy prescription, it's a reality. If you break something, you own it. And then how do you own it? Are you going to coerce it and rebuild it? Or are you only going to be focusing on the symptom, which is Hamas, and not focus on the Iranian regime? I would say that one has to have a comprehensive approach, which is focus on Hamas, focus on the Iranian regime, right? Take punitive measures against any demonstration of Islamism or hostility towards Israel and the Palestinian territories, right? And develop it upon your value system to create infrastructure. You be the one that create infrastructure, and you monitor the educational curriculum, not have UNRWA to do that. But in order to do that, you're going to need to allocate an enormous amount of resources and have the proficiency to manage it effectively. And Israel is unwilling to do the former and incapable of doing the latter.
I think that, unfortunately, I think that you're right as regards Israel's and really the world's approach to Israel's responsibility for the Palestinians, specifically in Gaza. I think that it's a little bit different when you're talking about, for example, Lebanon, where Israel and Lebanon have been at war twice before. We came in responding to the threats and the aggression from Lebanon every time. We're going to have to do that again sooner rather than later, a third time. And I don't think there's anyone who would then say at the end of the day, well, now Israel is responsible to rehabilitate, reorganize, and reconstitute Lebanon. Will it potentially give rise to, down the line, Hezbollah regaining its force as it did in 2006 or post the Second Lebanon War and really possibly even strengthening itself? Quite possibly, but I don't think there's anything which Israel intends to do in Lebanon other than destroy the threat.
I think Lebanon is a different case because it's a sovereign state, right? Gaza is a non-entity. And the fact that Gaza is a non-entity, it means that Israel has to own it. In terms of Lebanon, it's a much easier case to have the international security own it after Israel breaks it, because Israel's forced to go to war with Hamas. It's not a matter of should, it's a matter of when. It's not if, it's when.
Yeah.
And it will be a very, very bloody war. But again, Israel has allowed terrorist proxies to encircle it and to develop significant infrastructure. You know, Israel knew for years that Hamas was developing tunnel network and did nothing. It was sort of very much living in the present moment of time. If there was peace and quiet that day, let's not worry about tomorrow. And similarly, in terms of Hezbollah, Israel has known for decades that Hezbollah was developing an enormous military capability that was part of an urban civilian infrastructure. You know, you're talking about houses, apartment blocks being built around rocket sites or rockets being part of the roofs of the building. Now, Israel allowed that to happen because it was like its entire approach was, if it's not bothering me today, I'm not going to, you know, disturb that rattlesnake. And that status quo is not tenable.
So, Barak, unfortunately, we haven't managed to touch on the Abraham Accords at all, and our time is running out. Maybe you can just give us 2 minutes on really that what was seen at the time as a change of the paradigm. Suddenly, Israel and its neighbors are discussing common interests rather than this ideology of Israel rejectionism and this drive to destroy Israel. And that's something which almost pre-October 7, almost had Saudi Arabia brought into that fold. Is that something that you see could still happen? Could that still be extended out based on the common interests of fighting really this common enemy of Iran? Or is it something which that boat has sailed already?
No, look, nobody does things because in international affairs because they are affable or kumbaya. Nobody does that. They do things for strategic interests. Now, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is irrelevant. It's a red herring in the broader geopolitical dynamics. And there was a confluence of things that took place that created a new reality. Not only the Iranian, there were three main things that took place simultaneously. There was the Iranian threat, there was GCC states' need to diversify their economies, right? Hungry for high-tech solutions, especially as they want their economies to be digitally based, right? And the third thing was that there, uh, America became an energy exporter for the first time. So when you have a confluence of those dynamics, you need to be part of a security architecture that will guarantee your security. Now, America has every interest to anchor its strategic interests in the region, right? While, as I said in the beginning, it pivots towards Asia. Saudi Arabia, however much Saudi Arabia may have a kind of, you know, pleasant reconciliation with Iran, it will always be surface based. And it will always need to be within the Western sphere of security interests. So, as Israel, I would even say that the recent conflict actually will reinforce the Abraham Accords because it's going to lead Israel to develop its own lines of military production. Israel will become much more militarily independent and emerge as a rising tiger of the region. So, what is required is for Western states to join the Abraham Accords, to deepen it, because they have investment and trade interests in the region that are significant. Britain is negotiating a free trade agreement with the Gulf for that reason. They've got military assets in the region. Britain often complements the US, especially when it comes to naval exercises or whether it be striking the Houthis. So by Western states, more Western nations joining the Abraham Accords, it can only serve to deepen and entrench this emerging security architecture and economic landscape.
So really, that is it would appear to be the real future, interest-based future of the Middle East, where we're looking at the countries really adopting this common approach both to economic productivity, economic development, and even ideological development in the face of this destructive force, this almost what we at the JCPA refer to a lot as the Red-Green Alliance. It's the communists on the one hand joining the radical Islamists on the other side, and pushing really a destructive ideology around the world.
But I would just like to just make one observation. I mentioned beforehand about the priority of autocratic regimes to survive, which is why Qatar is ambiguous. It's why China adopts a transactional approach upon which it builds a diplomatic and security approach. GCC states are no different. Their strategic priority is to survive. Now, to survive, they must diversify their economies. they must recognize Israel and have security ties with Israel because, Israel is a pivotal player, within CENTCOM now. So it's about survival. It's not about a shift in consciousness. It's not about a newfound love for Israel.
Yeah.
A strong Israel is a secure Israel.
Only when you have that ability to, as we started the conversation, when you have that ability to deter your enemies, strength gives that ability to say, I am here, I can stand up for myself, and I won't be kicked around. When you're the local punching bag, then it doesn't embody any type of confidence around you and doesn't inspire confidence, and therefore brings really weakens the country.
So in contrast,
If I may, Barak, we have to
yeah,
finish. One last closing message, 1 minute.
that in contrast to America that speaks about the priority to de-escalate, when confronting autocratic regimes that are going to be hegemonic and belligerent by nature, it's a manifestation of their internal governance and character. There's a simple equation that often is not recognized by Western governments. By willing to embrace brinkmanship with your adversary, that's what actually creates de-escalation. Not, and in
Not
contrast,
appeasement.
but by focusing on de-escalation, that provokes your adversary to embrace brinkmanship towards you.
Without question, appeasement never has really worked along the way, and it's something which should be really cautioned against. Barak, unfortunately, we really have run out of time. Thank you before we've even got close to exhausting these subjects. So really, thank you very much for joining us. I will reserve, if I may, the right to call you back again and to discuss again on these subjects. There are many, many different aspects that need to be looked at really with a magnifying glass to understand what exactly is going on and how we can understand the situation in a way to better influence a more positive outcome really for all of the regional players. So again, thank you very much, Barak, for joining us. To our audience, thank you again for joining us. We will be back with you again next Monday. So in the meantime, please do keep safe. Have a good Shabbat, and really just pray for Israel's success in destroying the terrorists